To Christ be loyal and be true, his banner be unfurled, and borne aloft till he secure the conquest of the world. To Christ the Lord be true, for he will go with you, and help you all your conflicts through. To Christ the Lord be true. To Christ be loyal and be true. He needs brave volunteers to stand against the powers of sin, moved not by crowns or fears. To Christ the Lord be true, for he will go with you and help you all your conflicts through. To Christ the Lord be true. To Christ be loyal and be true, in noble service prove your faith and your fidelity, the fervor of your love. To Christ the Lord be true, for he will go with you and help you all your conflicts through. To Christ the Lord be true. To Christ be loyal and be true, and he will be your friend, defending and protecting you to life's triumphant end. To Christ the Lord be true, for he will go with you and help you all your conflicts through. To Christ the Lord be true.
Came back tonight here, and we know we have several that are sick that would be here and struggling with pain, like Laura. She's not feeling well and it's hurting, and I know others are too. And so we need to continue to remember these in prayer, as Johnny did such an excellent job doing today. And several's got colds and such like. And so hopefully we'll get on the mend. And we've got this weather in Arkansas that changes, and it'd be real cold and freezing cold, and then it'll be 70 by Christmas, they say. So anyway, and it's not going to be a white Christmas around here, but hopefully it will. And Molly left today and said she wanted snow. I said, well, you're going to have to go somewhere else. So anyway, because we won't have any, but we might one day. I want us to think tonight about qualities to be sought by each Christian. This is a continuation of the study that we began last week, and we're going to have several of these. I don't have an A through Z. We started with A and had altruism, and then I think we skipped to C. But we won't have A through Z of this, but we will have several. And because, when you look in the Bible, the New Testament and the Old Testament, as far as that goes, has several qualities that are to be sought by Christians. When a company goes out and hires somebody, they have a certain list of qualities they want. They want integrity. They want them to be industrious. They want them to have a good work ethic and things of this nature. And really, we need to realize that God has certain qualities that He wants His people to have. And so, as we continue this series of lessons, I hope that in each lesson we'll deal with these qualities, and that we'll have a desire to grow and excel in each of the qualities we discuss. I'm not going to repeat the ones we mentioned last week because the list would get longer and longer and longer as we go. So keep your sermon outlines and you go back and to look at those and to keep up with them. And then you'll have a complete list by the time that we finish our study. The first thing that we want to mention tonight is the idea of compassion. Compassion. I don't know if you feel compassion or not. A lot of times we feel pity, and we're to have that quality probably. I don't know if it's in this list. I can't recall. I haven't looked that far down yet. But, you know, there is a difference in having pity and having compassion. Pity at one point, we'll look at something and we'll say, oh, poor, whatever, dog on the side of the road, poor person, or whatever, and we'll have pity for them. We'll feel sorry for them. Compassion stops. Compassion strives to help if possible. And when we look at the Old and New Testament words for compassion, they carry with it the idea, number one, of being merciful. Being merciful. I want you to think about that. Now, have compassion on somebody. Compare that we are merciful toward them. And then we're favorable toward them. We show them favor. We have compassion for them. The idea then is that we're sympathetic to them. We strive to even maybe empathize for them. Those that have struggled with pain in their life knows what it's like to do that. And probably all of us, the age that we are, has our aches and our pains and things in that our life, that's part of life. And we know what it is to experience that. And we can be sympathetic toward that. Compassion also carries with the idea in the Bible of being loyal, of being there where dependable and loyal, where people can count on us. And yes, it conveys the idea of loving. If you look at the various verses that we have in the Bible where the word compassion stands, it really up to the context. And then finally, this idea of having compassion on someone may lead us to have forgiveness and a relationship. Go back to the idea of being merciful, and it does carry with it the idea of being merciful. If we're merciful for somebody, we realize that sometimes there, but for the grace of God goes I. And the scripture talks about, if someone forgives you, you're to forgive others or you won't be forgiven. If someone shows mercy to you, you need to be merciful to them. And the same way is true with even compassion. If people show compassion on us, we ought to have compassion on them. And even if we're mistreated, sometimes we ought to stop and to realize and to have compassion on the person that did that and be able to say, I forgive you. To want to be restoring that relationship that we have, the relationship of love. I want us to consider these verses because I believe compassion is the heart and the core of these verses. I read, first of all, from Psalms 112 and verse 4. Unto the upright there arises light in darkness, and he is gracious. He's full of compassion and righteous. Think about number one, where these things grow from. They grow from an upright person that arises in the light out of darkness. You see, those in the darkness, they don't understand the need for compassion sometimes. They can be hard-hearted. They can be unsympathetic to people that go around. They can see someone on the side of the road that needs help and never think about helping them. They can see someone in need and never think about helping them. And they just go on hard-hearted. And yet for the upright, for those that or out of darkness and into the marvelous light of God has experienced God's compassion that caused him to bleed and die on the cross, because sent his son to bleed and die on the cross. They're walking in the light. They're wanting to be like Jesus. And then talks about the fact that he is righteous and he's full of compassion. That's how God is to us. And we need to realize that the upright are those that are no longer in darkness but light. To be gracious, to be full of compassion and righteous. Paul in Colossians, the 3rd chapter, in verse 12, talked about the idea of compassion. And reading from the New American Standard, because the words compassion is sometimes translated other words. But in the New American Standard 2020 version of Colossians 3:12, Paul says, so as those who have been chosen of God. Notice the connection. In Psalms you had those, the upright, that arises in the light out of darkness. And then you had now those who have been chosen of God. Well, that's Christians. Qualified, further, holy and beloved. Set apart and beloved. And then he says, put on a heart. New American Standard says of compassion. New King James says mercies. But the word there conveys the idea of compassion. A different word is used for mercy in the Greek New Testament. And then kindness, humility, gentleness, and patience. And so as we think about having compassion, we need to have that. Peter would sum it up this way in 1 Peter 3 and verse 8. Finally, all of you, to who? All Christians, be of one mind. Be of one mind. Unity of thought. Having compassion. The NET, I think, correctly expands on that. Be sympathetic for one another. Love as brothers. Be tender-hearted. Be courteous. Be sympathetic. Have compassion. To understand, try to understand what it's like to be in the other person's shoes. Try to understand what it's like to go through the things that people go through. And I know from a fact that when I've experienced something and somebody else is experiencing the same thing, I can understand. I can be sympathetic toward them because I've been there and I know. And I have a greater sense and maybe, hopefully, a better sense to help them. But even if we haven't gone through the same things, we need to feel for them. We need to be sympathetic toward them. We need to have compassion on them. The main thing that separated the Good Samaritan from the Levite and the priest is the Levite and the priest, they had pity on the man that was beat. But they had other things to do, maybe good reasons to pass by. I don't know. But the Samaritan was moved with compassion. And he stopped, he acted, and he was the good neighbor. Well, the next one is kind of hard to preach on, maybe around Christmas time, but I'm going to do it. And that's the idea of contentment. I've wrestled with contentment, thinking about it. The word translated contentment in the New Testament conveys the idea of finding resources within oneself or being self-sufficient, or feeling that what one has is enough, or the feeling of being satisfied with what one has. Now, I want you to think about all of that. The idea, number one, of being self-sufficient finding resource within oneself or being self-sufficient. Have you ever had to just make do with what you had? That's the idea of being self-sufficient, isn't it? Making do with what you had. Well, it'd be better if we had this, it'd be better if we had that. You know, there are jobs that are hard to do if you don't have the proper tools. And yet, sometimes you just have to make do with what you've got. And so it's the idea of finding resources there within oneself, of trying to make it work, trying to figure it out. And then being self-sufficient. Or then, this is where it really starts getting hard sometimes, feeling that one has enough, or the feeling of being satisfied with what one has. Oh, we always would maybe like something else. We all maybe would like to have the latest model of something. We all might like to have something better. Now, sometimes we need something better, and that's where, the idea of contentment goes along with need, and sometimes that's what we have to really sit down and judge ourselves and weigh things out just to kind of see how we're at and what is the motivation behind that. But I think this idea, the New Testament concept of contentment, carries with it the idea of being able to be in a state that we're able to exist in that. And we see this in the writing of the Apostle Paul. In Philippians, the 4th chapter, beginning in verse 11, Paul says, "Not that I speak in regard of need." Remember, we said this morning that Paul was writing this from prison. And chapter 4 does not sound like he's in prison, does it? But he said, "Not that I speak in regard of need." Paul, do you need anything? Well, yes, I need your chains gone. Paul, do you need anything? Yes, I'd like to go where I wanted to without a guard. Yes, I'd like to be free. But Paul says, I'm not writing and speaking in regard of need. Why, Paul? And here it is. "For I have learned in whatever state I am to be content." There's our word. To be content. What had Paul learned? Well, I know how to abound and I know how to be abased. With and without. And he said, everywhere in all things I've learned both to be full and to be hungry, to be both abound and to suffer need. Contentment. Making do with what you have, if that's sufficient. Well, we go to 1 Timothy, the 6th chapter. In the context of the 6th chapter is the love of money. The love of money is the root of all evil. That's in this chapter. But he also reminds us that everything we have, we're going to leave behind. Now he says, now godliness, being like God, with contentment is a great thing. Well, we talked about contentment. But listen to what he says. "For we brought nothing into this world, and it is certain we can carry nothing out." The things that you and I have, whatever they are, we're going to leave them behind one day. They're going to be somebody else's stuff. And as we talk about every once in a while of going and through and cleaning this out and cleaning, y'all have the same conversation. We need to clean this out, we need to clean that, and a few people do. I have Michael Brinkley's parents, for example, who both died of COVID back a couple of years ago, within minutes of each other. About 2 years or so before they passed away, they sold their house and they went through and sold a lot of their possessions. they got rid of a lot of things because they decided that they didn't want to leave those things to have the children deal with these things, and the children had to deal with some of the things anyway. Well, Paul is wanting us to realize that we brought nothing into this world, and it's certain we should carry nothing out. And then, again, the rub. To understand that, and having food and clothing, with these shall we be content. Struggle of this verse, isn't it? To think about it. And then Hebrews 13 in verse 5, let your conduct be without covetousness. Don't want what somebody else has, but be content with such things as you have. For he himself will say, I'll never leave you or forsake you. God's going to give us what we need in life. And then the idea of contrition. We read about this word more in the Old Testament than we do in the New Testament. And the words translated contrite in the Old Testament convey the idea, number one, of something broken. Keep that in mind. We'll talk about it. Something crippled or something crushed. Something broken, something crippled, or something crushed. Think of these words. There are 3 verses we want to expand on. Look at Psalms 51. Now, Psalm 51 is a unique chapter. It is the writing of David after Nathan the prophet came to him. And remember how Nathan got David to confess his sin. He told the story about the neighbor's lamb. Remember the story? There was a neighbor that had a little lamb that was part of the family, and I'm adding some to it, but it was really basically part of the family, and his neighbor wanted it because he was going to throw a feast and everything. He didn't want to give that one of his lambs, so he got this lamb over here that was part of the family of this neighbor. And he cooked it. Remember, David got bad? He got angry, and he was ready to go exact vengeance on this man that stole the neighbor's lamb and killed it. And when he finally couldn't figure out, Nathan the prophet, by the inspiration of the Holy Spirit, said, "Thou art the man." And after you hear that story, and then David sat down and wrote the words of Psalms 51. Against thee and thee only have I sinned. He was penitent. And so David wrote in verse 17 of the text, so the sacrifices of God are a broken spirit. There you are. Broken. A broken and a contrite heart. And the word contrite here carries with the idea of a crushed heart. These, O God, you will not despise. When's the last time that we went before God because of our sin and we say, God, my heart is crushed. I'm sorry that I've sinned against you, and you only have I sinned. In Isaiah, the 57th chapter, in verse 15, Isaiah writes, for thus says the high and the lofty one who inhabits eternity. Think about that. Who has been and always will be. Who always has been and always will be. Inhabits eternity. Whose name is holy. And he says, I dwell in the high and holy place. Well, who lives there with you? With him who has a contrite, the NET says humiliated and humble spirit. Humiliated in the sense that we see we're nothing without God, that we're sinful and need God's help. We're helpless and need God's help. We're broken and need God's help. We're crippled and crushed and needs God's help. Humiliated, contrite, and humble spirit. To revive the spirit of the humble and to revive the heart of the contrite ones. Revive us, O Lord. We need that, don't we? As children of God. And finally, Isaiah 66 and verse 2. For all of those things my hand has made, and all of those things exist, says the Lord. But on this one I will look. God says, I made everything, but I want to tell you who I'm going to look on. On him who is poor and of a contrite. And again, the word here in this particular idea carries with it the idea of being crippled or broken spirit. And who trembles at my word. When's the last time we've stood before God and quaked at His word, trembled at His word? When's the last time that we've really honestly say, speak, Lord, your servant hears. I'm broken, I'm poor. And we sing the song sometimes, bring Christ your broken life, so marred by sin. That's the kind of heart we're talking about. That's the kind of spirit we need to have. And then lastly tonight, we think about courage. There's various words translated courage in the Old and New Testament, but all of them convey the idea and the meaning of strength, having courage, and being hardened. And when we think about these words, the use of these words becomes evident when we look at the scriptures where they contain. We read in Deuteronomy 31 and verse 6, and by the way, I had to go back and look because I ran across this verse and I thought, well, I used it not too long ago. We had a series of lessons on courage where we had 4 or 5 lessons on courage, and this verse was part of that. But he said, be strong and of good courage. And then he describes, do not fear, nor be afraid of them, talking about the people that were in the land. If I remember correctly, this, Moses is talking to Joshua about leading the people. He is the one who goes with you. He will not leave you and forsake you. To have courage, no matter what we face in life, knowing that God is there. We go back to this morning's lesson, realizing that God is on the throne. He's reigning. The all-powerful, omnipotent God. Psalms 27 verse 14. Wait on the Lord and be of good courage. And He shall strengthen your heart. Wait, I say, on the Lord. Again, Psalms 31 and verse 24. Be of good courage, and He shall strengthen your heart, all you that hope in the Lord. Isaiah 41 and verse 6. Everyone helped his neighbor and said to his brother, be of courage. Folks, that needs to describe the church, doesn't it? It needs to describe the church of Southside. Everyone helped his neighbor. Everyone stood by one another. Everyone said, be of good courage. May we always strive to build one another up and help one another. But lastly, we close with the idea that courage can also convey the idea of not being afraid and being brave. Don't be afraid, but be brave. Psalms 27, verse 8, when you said, seek my face, my heart said to you, your face, O Lord, I will seek. Don't be afraid. Seek the face of God. And finally, 1 Corinthians, the 16th chapter and verse 13. Paul's admonition to the church at Corinth. Watch. Sometimes that just carries with the idea of waiting and watching. Stand fast in the faith. Be brave. Be strong. In other words, don't be afraid, but be brave and be strong. The lesson is finished. If you need to respond in any way, won't you come as we stand and sing?
When we walk with the Lord in the light of His word, what a glory He sheds on our way. While we do His good will, He abides with us still, and with all who will trust and obey. Trust and obey, for there's no other way to be happy in Jesus, but to trust and obey. Not a shadow can rise, not a cloud in the skies, but His smile quickly drives it away. Not a doubt nor a fear, not a sigh nor a tear can abide while we trust and obey. Trust and obey, for there's no other way to be happy in Jesus, but to trust and obey. Not a burden we bear, not a sorrow we share, but our toil He doth richly repay. Not a grief nor a loss, not a frown nor a cross, but is blessed if we trust and obey. Trust and obey, for there's no other way to be happy in Jesus, but to trust and obey. Then in fellowship sweet, we will sit at His feet, or we'll walk by His side in the way. What He says we will do, where He sends we will go. Never fear, only trust and obey. Trust and obey, for there's no other way to be happy in Jesus, but to trust and obey.